Welcome to Policy Precision. We're here to give you an unbiased dive into executive orders, and I'm Ethan Caldwell, ready to break down the details.
And I'm Nora Harper, here to connect those details to their human side. Today, we are tackling a big one, Executive Order 141193. It's a new policy that's putting tariffs on goods coming in from Canada, and we're going to unpack what it says and what it could mean.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. I'll be walking us through the mechanics, the legal nuts and bolts, what the order actually says and does.
Right, and then I'll take those mechanics and explore the meaning. How does a policy like this actually ripple out and affect real people and real lives? We're looking at one order, but through two very different lenses.
So first things first, to really get why this executive order even exists, you have to start with the problem it claims to solve. The whole thing is built on the idea of a national emergency. Specifically, a public health crisis tied to illicit drugs coming across the border.
And you can just feel the weight of the language in the order itself. It says this challenge threatens the fabric of our society. So this isn't being framed as just a simple law enforcement issue. It's being presented as an existential threat. And that's the entire justification for the major economic moves that follow. And to really hammer that threat home, the order puts a number on it. A very big, very stark number, 9.5 million.
So what is that number? Well, according to the order, that's how many Americans could have been killed by the amount of fentanyl seized at the northern border just last year. Now, the document is upfront that way more is seized at the southern border. But the argument here is that fentanyl is so incredibly potent that any amount poses a catastrophic danger. This number is the human cost that's been used to justify the entire economic action. All right, so Nora has laid out the why, this idea of a national emergency. So let's pivot to the what. What does this order actually do? Time to get into the legal and economic mechanics. So the crucial point here is the legal foundation. This isn't happening through normal trade negotiations. The president is invoking some pretty powerful laws, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and the National Emergencies Act. Essentially, by defining the drug flow as an unusual and extraordinary threat, it unlocks the president's authority to regulate international commerce directly.
And here's what that authority looks like in practice. The order creates two new tiers of tariffs, which are basically taxes on imported goods. They're set to kick in on February 4th, 2025. We're looking at a 25% tax on most things coming from Canada and a separate 10% tax specifically on energy products.
Now, the order uses a specific phrase here, ad valorem duties. It sounds complicated, but it just means the tax is based on the value of the goods. This isn't a flat fee, it's a percentage. So a 25% tax on an expensive piece of machinery is going to be a much bigger deal, in dollar terms, than the same tax on something cheap. It's a key detail.
Okay, so Ethan just broke down the technical stuff perfectly. But what does a 25% ad valorem duty actually feel like? When it jumps off the page and walks into our lives.
This is really the million-dollar question for everybody, isn't it? For businesses and for you. Because a tax at the border rarely stays at the border. That cost has a way of trickling down the supply chain, and it often ends up right on the price tag you see at the store.
Now, the order doesn't list every single product, but if we look at what the U.S. imports from Canada, we can get a pretty clear picture. We're talking about huge categories, like building materials and lumber. So the cost of a new house could go up. Automotive parts, so fixing your car might get more expensive. Even everyday things like certain foods and paper goods could see a price hike. What's really interesting is that this order doesn't just create a new policy and stop there. It actually spells out what could happen next. It presents two very, very different paths for the US and Canada.
It's basically an ultimatum. Path 1 is all about cooperation. The order says if the president decides Canada has taken adequate steps to deal with the drug crisis, then the tariffs can be lifted. Simple as that.
But then there's path 2, and that's a potential trade war. The order explicitly says that if Canada retaliates with its own tariffs on American goods, the president can hit back even harder, maybe by increasing the U.S. tariffs. It really does put the ball directly in Canada's court.
And that really brings us to the fundamental question at the heart of all this, doesn't it? Is using a huge economic lever like this the right way to solve a public health crisis? Or does it just risk kicking off a brand new crisis with one of our biggest allies?
And that's the core tension of this executive order. It completely blurs the lines between trade policy, foreign policy, and public health. It leaves all of us to think about that very tricky line between national security and international partnership.